book, The Narcissistic Mode, Metafiction as a Strategy in Mole Flanders, Tom Jones and Tristan Shandy, published in 2007. Besides, he has authored and edited multiple noteworthy critical volumes which cover areas as diverse as Tagore and his Circle, Tagore and Environment, Women of Shantiniketan, the continuum of ideas between the Bengali Renaissance and the Scottish Enlightenment, the confluence of thought between Tagore and the British visionary Patrick Geddes, post-colonial reading of the noted chemist Prafullo Chandra Roy. He is joint coordinator of the UGC UKRI project on the Scotland-India continuum, Tagore and his Circle, and the deputy coordinator of the UGC SAP project on Rabindranath Tagore, the East-West confluence at the Department of English. Apart from his academic engagements, he has also translated and performed in Tagore's dance dramas as national and international programs. Among his major awards, he has won the Outstanding Thesis Award by the Government of India, the Research Award by the UGC, the Oxford 18th Century Bursary, and a host of academic recognitions. He has traveled extensively as project coordinator for the UKRI Award to Edinburgh, Scotland, as invited speaker to the University of Oxford and Twickenham, Tongji University, Shanghai, China, and has also delivered the Tagore Memorial Lecture at the Rabindranath Tagore Center under the Mahatma Gandhi Institute at Mauritius. Professor Amrit Sen is presently officiating as the Director of Granthon Vibhag, the publication wing of Visva Bharati since July 2018. He is presently also joint editor of the Visva Bharati Quarterly. I personally had requested him to speak on John Fowles's The French Lieutenant's Woman, and he has kindly agreed to do so. Now I request Professor Sen to please deliver his much-awaited lecture on Games Author's Play, the reading of Fowles's French Lieutenant's Woman. Professor Sen.
Right. Thank you, Shoykot. Thank you, Tanmay.
Sir, yes, sir, before we begin, I request our participants to keep their audio mute. So it's a request to all the participants here. Okay, sir, you can.
Right. Thank you, Tanmay, for that intervention. My request to you also, all of you, is to mute your microphones so that we have less ambient noise. I'll start with my presentation so that we can move quickly into the gist of the program. Is this visible now?
Yes, yes, now it is.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Just a quick thank you to Midnapore College, which is so very dear to my heart, really, because I've been there a number of times. All the colleagues there are my peers and very generous and active people. A special thanks to Shoykot also. Shoykot has been a long-time friend. And if Orpita is watching, greetings to Orpita, who's hosted me at her place and is a wonderful young poet. I fondly remember her reciting a few poems for me. So with that, here is the title of my presentation, Games Author's Play, Reading the French Lieutenant's Woman. And I can see a lot of my former students, present students also logging in. It's a text which I've relished teaching, discussing with younger people. And it's a text that's really very close to my heart because it goes back to my original research interest in metafiction. So what I'm going to try and do is, and this is something which Shoykot also had suggested to me, is try and build up a certain date and a certain concept. You see, The French Lieutenant's Woman is published in 1969. Just 2 years earlier, we had the publication of two major works, one very well known, one not so well known. The first was, of course, Roland Barthes' Death of the Author, something which has crept into the curriculum of almost all universities. Many of our students know the text of The Death of the Author, although I'll take a look at the text also, because Very often we know the concept, but we do not exactly know the terms that the author uses. Right. I should not say that the author, because Barth would immediately sort of poke me and say use scripture instead. The other essay that I'm going to talk about very briefly, but is an important essay, is also by John Barth. So it's a tale of two Barths, actually. But this Barth is B-A-R-T-H, and an American critic who wrote an interesting essay called The Literature of Exhaustion, followed it up by a later essay called The Literature of Replenishment. Now, many of you know Rolla Barthes. Very few of you actually have read John Barth. But both these essays came out in 1967. Fowles is, of course, writing this novel in 1969. 1969 is also the date when Foucault's What is an Author came out. So around the time 1967 to 1969, therefore, there's a lot of attention, critical attention being paid to this concept of the author. Now, Fowles, of course, mentions Rolla Barthes in The French Lieutenant's Woman. So what I'm trying to look at is how a critical text or several critical texts and a fictional text looks at this notion of the author and deconstructs it in a certain way. It's point number one. Point number two is how there is the presence of what is called a historiographic metafiction within the text. So Fowles is writing in 1969 about events in 1867 and the form of fiction in 1867. And one of the intertexts that Fowles uses here, very, very importantly, and this is going to be a part of my discussion, is Darwin. You see, Darwin's treatise, Just Origin of Species, had just come out. It was just 10 years, not even 10 years old. Now, Darwin had cast a great spell in 1867, and Fowles is very cleverly using it in 1969 to talk about the evolution of the novel. And therefore, I am going to link the evolution theory of Darwin to the evolution theory of the author and see how Darwin provides a very critical intertext through which a major category of the novel is being addressed. And also like to see, and this is in the last part of my discussion, this concept of America, because America is no longer in Fowles just a nation or a continent. It's a certain binary to Victorian England. And America is also a society under evolution, or a society that had substantially evolved, let's say. So evolution becomes a key word in my text. But how does an author, scripter, play around with this notion of evolution while critically interrogating the modes of fiction itself? So I'm going to move across a few technical terms: the author, scripter, placer, jouissance, metafiction, historiographic metafiction. And I'm going to try and link it all up with this theory of evolution and see how the entire fabric or texture of the text becomes a game that authors play, right? So there are a lot of terms that are going to be bandied around, and I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to reading The French Lieutenant's Woman. Now, this is the man who problematized this entire discourse up for us, for whom I'm sitting in my office today and trying to work my way through this concept of the author. And let me straight away come to Barth. The death of the author, as you know, 1967, one of the fundamental works of post-structuralism. And for students who have read the text, I invite you to go back to it once again. For those of you who haven't, take a look. May I just add that primarily this is meant for students, not really very serious researchers, because this would appear rather simple to them. But Barthes begins by addressing this author figure as a modern figure. You see, this is something which Foucault also talks about in folk literature, for example, folk culture. This figure of the author does not really exist. You know, even for a text like, say, Ramayana, while we sort of address it to Valmiki, you know, Ramayana is a text which so many authors really contribute, and whoever recites the Ramayana becomes its own author. It undergoes so many changes. But Barthes links it with, you know, a certain amount of capitalistic, individualistic position, and looks at it as a phenomenon that comes up through English empiricism, the operative philosopher that I would, political philosopher, that I would use is probably the term called possessive individualism, which was coined by James Macpherson. French rationalism, Barthes, of course, ascribes this to French nationalism, and the personal faith of the Reformation. Remember, the individual reading and writing becomes so very important to the figure of the Reformation. Discovered the prestige of the individual, possessive individualism once again, as a human person, right? This is where Barthes says the figure of the author becomes so critical. So positivism, epitome and culmination, as you can see, of the capitalist ideology, which has attached the greatest importance to the person of the author. So in a certain way, personal wealth, personal religion, personal writing becomes very critical to this notion of throughout. And therefore, it is through this maze, as it were, that the figure of the author emerges. But Barthes suggests that, you know, the author is never more than the instance writing, right? Just as I is nothing other than the instance saying I. Language, he says, Barthes says, those are subject, not a person. So the author is a subject function. That's what Barthes is trying to say. And this subject, empty outside of the very enunciation which defines it, suffices to make language hold together. So Barthes is taking away what you can call the personality of the author and imbuing it with a certain subject function within the text. And therefore, you see, the very personality of the author becomes redundant, really. What we need to understand, as Barthes says, is what is his function within the discourse, what is the author's function within the process of writing and language. That is what is Barthes' major concern. And then comes this concept of the time that Barthes says, what does the author do with time? It's always conceived as the past of his own book. So if the author does not exist, the book does not exist. Barthes says this is not true. Barthes says that language existed prior to the concept of the author. Even before an author existed, narratives existed. Narratives were circulated and read, understood. Therefore, this very concept of the, a priori author, who's a prior to the book, is a false concept. Book and author stand automatically on a single line as we now see it, divided into a before and after. So once the author comes to dominate discourse, there's a time before the author and there's a time of the book after the author. The author is thought to nourish the book, which to say that he exists before it, thinks, suffers, lives for it, and is in the same relation of antecedence to his work as a father to his child. See, this is something, for example, that even critics of Tagore will immediately talk about, how the Jivan Devata is related to his concept of Kadambari and so on and so forth. So it's as it were, if there was no Tagore, no Kadambari living, there would have been no Tagore, as it were. But Rabindranath is not just an author, he's also a function, is the way in which language is expressing itself. In complete contrast, of course, let me add, before people just jump on to criticize me, that this is a theoretical position that is being taken by Barth, right? There are, of course, other possible theoretical positions which are taken on by romantic theorists. There are theses which are written by even Marxist critics who consider the subject writing, his position, his class is extremely important. I'm not going to go into that. I'm trying to understand what Barth is trying to say. And maybe later on we can debate whether you agree with the position or not. And he says, and this is where he uses the term scripter, he says the term modern scripter is born simultaneously within the text, is in no way equipped with being preceding or exceeding the writing. You see, author and authority, that's what Barth says needs to be taken away. And therefore he's involving this term called the scripter. It's not the subject with the book as a predicate. There's no other time than that of enunciation, and every text is eternally written here and now. So the concept of the author as a priori and the book as post priori is taken away, and Barth argues that there is only one time when language is being formulated in writing. And please ignore the typos. There are certain few typos which have crept in. The text is not a line of words releasing a single theological meaning. Therefore, if the author exists, then there is only one meaning. But if you take away the author, and if there is an endless play of language, then there are multi-dimensional meanings. The message of the author, God, goes bunkum, and a variety of writings, none of them original, blend and clash. And it is therefore that Barth also uses this concept of textile texture in a certain way, where there are multiple threads of meaning existing within a certain work. The text, you can see, is a tissue of quotations drawn from innumerable centers of culture. So as it is, there is no one single author. There is a culture and a host of authors who go into the making of the text. Once the author claim is removed, the claim to decipher a text becomes quite futile. To give a text an author, therefore, is to limit meaning. And when you take away the author, you unleash the barrage of meanings that a text can potentially hold. Now, obviously, all students here and all peers can immediately see how this opens up. This becomes the moment when the post-structuralist gate is actually opened. And that is where Barth becomes such a fundamental critic. I would invite all students who are listening in to please read the original texts. Now that, unless and until you do that, and you try to see what Barth is trying to do with language, just knowing a concept of the death of the author and the birth of the reader is going to be a little skimpy. Right. Therefore, instead of the author, what Barth is actually trying to suggest is not merely the reader, but a total existence of writing. You see, what Barth is therefore throwing at you is language and language systems from many cultures entering into mutual relations of dialogue, and language is perpetually parodying language. In fact, the death of the author is a parody of Thomas Mallory's La Morte d'Arthur, right? So you see, Barth is very clever in the way in which he's playing around with language and parody. Contestation, so meanings contesting one another, something Fouts will use. But there's only one place where this multiplicity is focused, and here Barth comes to the reader. He says, take away the author, say how the language game reaches the reader and how it plays out. And he says classic criticism has never paid any attention to the reader. We're now beginning to let ourselves be fooled no longer by the arrogant recriminations of good society in the favor of very things it sets aside. It is necessary to overthrow the myth. And then comes that grand announcement which all of us love to quote: the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. Now, while we were designing this PowerPoint, may I just invite you to look at that panel underneath, the money heist mask that we've used. Very interestingly, once again, it's that, the reader, the multiple readers who become or who are foregrounded rather than the one single figure of the author, the reader who wears many masks, the reader who has many, many personalities which are located within and who teases out the innumerable meanings located within the text. You see how the route from Barthes to Derrida is very clear. Now, Barthes, of course, talks about two kinds of texts. In fact, in S by Z, where Barthes is actually looking at Balzac's Sarrasine, he talks about the realist text. And you see, the French Lieutenant's Woman starts as being a realist text, right? It's a story of the familiar Victorian story of what you can call a triangular relationship between the conventional romantic hero Charles, the what you can call the conservative woman Ernestina, and the French lieutenant's whore, or the French lieutenant's woman, the fallen woman, as it Sarah Woodruff. So you see, Barthes is suggesting that a realist text, apparently considered to be transparent, having an unitary meaning and easily accessible to the reader, is a readerly text in which the reader is only a passive and inert consumer of the author's product. Think of the detective story, for example. Think of the romance which many of us read, for example, The Mills and the Boones. Now, it has a steady structure. You expect it to end in a certain way, and it gives us a certain pleasure, but it does not force us to think. It does not force us to engage. He says, on the contrary, the experimental text, which he calls the writerly text, requires the active participation of the reader in establishing the meaning of the text. The greatest example of, in my opinion, and the earliest one, something which I take greatly to my heart, is Tristram Shandy. Where Sterne is asking, well, if you want to know how beautiful Widow Wadman is, why don't you write out her beauty? Because your concept of beauty and mine is not the same. So what does Sterne do? He slips in a blank page, right? So such a text, Barthes says, is a site of resistance to stable signification. A realist text has this concept of a stable signification and is characterized by difference and aporia and deadlocks in understanding, where meaning is constantly under erasure. So there are these gaps, fissures as it were, which are pregnant with meaning and therefore creating possibilities or perpetual deference or difference in terms of meaning. He says that the writerly text, you see, the readerly text is determined by the author, so it comes with meaning packaged in. But the writerly text is a perpetual present. So it is, as you read it, meaning is circulating and being created by you, upon which no consequent language can be superimposed. The writerly text is therefore ourselves writing before the infinite play of the world is traversed, intersected, stopped, plasticized by some singular system. So ideology, genius, criticism. So it's like, an infinite play of meanings sans the presence of the author, which reduces the plurality of entrances, the opening of networks, and the infinity of languages. Once again, I'll a little later on link this to the concept of Lyotard, who will posit that language games, or the games that you can play with the structure of languages, is infinite. And therefore, at any given moment, meaning too can be infinitely regressed. The Barthes also includes two concepts, which I'm sure many of you know. I'll still talk about them just for a very brief while. And this is where Barthes talks about two kinds of reading. You see, we talk about Barthes, the reader, and the author, but two kinds of reading. He says the horizontal and the vertical. The horizontal reading, fostered by the readerly text, say a detective fiction or a romance, is concerned only with the storyline of the text, and it ignores the play of language and treats the text as transparent. Right? Imagine a detective story where the detective suddenly raises his hand and says, I can't solve this problem. Will you please, the reader, help me do this? You see, this is unthought of in the readerly text, in the readerly text, because you see, you consume a readerly text. The readerly text is, in fact, a product of capitalism. On the other hand, the writerly text, he says, demands vertical reading, not captivated by plot alone, but by the play of language and the layering of significance. Say, a Sterne, or say an Italo Calvino, even Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or for that matter, something which all of you read, the French Lieutenant's one, of course, but also Midnight's Children by Rushdie. While horizontal reading gives the reader intermittent pleasure or plaisir, that's the concept that Barthes uses. You see, it's intermittent pleasure. It's for the temporary, time being. The vertical reading imparts jouissance, a state of bliss or ecstasy, because you are drawn into the process of creation. Along with the author, you become a party to the process of creation itself. This creative response, invoked by the writerly text, is what transforms the reader from being a passive consumer into a blissful scribe or scripter. And therefore, Barthes once again talks about the demise of the author and the simultaneous birth of the scripter. Right? This was a rather detailed reading of a few texts of Barthes. Now let me come to the other Barthes, John Barthes, whom very few of you actually know. He says by exhaustion, he categorized this. He said that, modern novels and realist novels are all exhausted. What did exhausted mean? Because he was attacked because people asked, are you then talking about the depth of the novel? He said, no. By exhaustion, I don't mean anything so tired as the subject of physical, moral, or intellectual decadence. And then comes the important word, only the used upness of certain forms or the felt exhaustion of certain possibilities. So the formulas of writing, when they are used up, it is then that Barthes says that realist fiction has entered into a state of a literature of exhaustion. And he suggests that even modernism has in certain ways fallen into used upness. But therefore, who is the author who can charge or replenish this literature of exhaustion? Barthes uses three figures, actually. He uses Borges, the Argentinian author. He uses Calvino, the Italian author. And he, of course, refers to Gabriel Garcia Marquez and this entire new genre of magical realism. Barthes suggests that Borges's genius lies in his application of the imaginative to the tradition. His artistic victory is that he confronts an intellectual dead end, and he talks about Pierre Menard and the way in which Borges is rewriting an already written text like Cervantes' Don Quixote. You see, those of you who read, and who study this concept of the intertext or afterlife of texts should read, Barthes and the way in which postmodernism approximates, appropriates, and then regurgitates and reforms or reads certain canonical texts. So confronts an intellectual dead end and employs it again against itself to accomplish new human work. You see, this is where, Barthes will later on tie up with the writings of Julia Kristeva. The Barthes also talks about Borges's apocalyptic ambience by working both within the tradition of the novel. So Barthes is not saying that, you create a novel which nobody can understand, right? Which is absolutely jumbled up. He says, use the tradition, but then interrogate it, but then change it, experiment with it, the boundaries of this, creating originality from the literary standard we had become accustomed to. And I want you to please focus on this part of Barthes, because this is precisely what John Fowles is going to do. You see, to understand, therefore, Fowles, we need to see what Fowles was looking at. Fowles is a very critical author. He was looking at the continent, and he's looking at the work, critical work that is being done. You see, please remember that this novel was Fowles' third novel after the Magus and Collectors. So Fowles had already perfected this art. He was already experimenting. But this is where he comes to realize what the critics are trying to tell him in a certain way, or that what his art is synchronous with certain ways of looking at textuality. And Barthes, therefore, uses a sort of image, and this image is very, very clever, a clever image. Barthes, in fact, has this novel. Barthes was also a novelist. So he has this novel called Lost in the Fun House. He uses this, this concept of the labyrinth, where all the possibilities of choice are embodied. Labyrinth is, in Bangla, is a gologthama, right? So you have, think about Bhul Bhulaiya, for example. You always have so many options to take. And at every point in the Bhul Bhulaiya, you have more options opening up before you. So Bhul Bhulaiya or a labyrinth is an endless possibility of freedom, right? So that freedom, that choice must be exhausted before one reaches the heart, right? If you don't think about Theseus, think about Harry Potter and what was it? The Goblet of Fire, where you have this concept of the maze. Now, Barthes, of course, then argues that the novel's genre, especially the ideal postmodernism, will rise above the quarrel between realism and irrealism, formalism and contestism, pure and committed literature, and will be like listening to jazz. So what was there, it must challenge, it must exhaust, it must revitalize, it must reuse. Understanding Fowles is very, very akin to understanding Barthes. Both of them, once again, let me reiterate, were novelists. And he gives the example of Marquez and Calvino, and he talks about Marquez really, the synthesis of straightforwardness and artifice, realism, magic, myth, political passion, non-political artistry, characterization, caricature, humor, and terror, not only artistically admirable, but also humanly wise, lovable, literally marvelous, right? Now, those of you who teach Rushdie in class might go back to Barthes and see what, how Rushdie too acknowledges Barthes as being an intellectual forefather. In fact, Barthes' essay, The Literature of Exhaustion, is seen in many quarters as the actual manifesto of postmodern fiction. Now, these are a few of my slides which I've used elsewhere. The theory of the game. Please remember that the game is fixed limits of time and place, rules freely accepted, absolutely binding, accompanied by a feeling of tension, different from ordinary life. Now, this process of creating fiction reading is something which the game sees as different from everyday life. The game is free, separate, uncertain, unproductive, make-believe, and governed by its own set of rules. Think of Ludo, for example. It's something which I've talked about ad nauseum, so I'm not going to reiterate that. But the game must have emerging new situations. Therefore, this concept of freedom, once again, change in moves, information levels, and then let me come to Lyotard. Lyotard talks about language games, which are the object of a contract. The second is that if there are no rules, then there is no game. But then Lyotard goes on to question and deconstruct these rules. And the third quality, he says, every utterance should be thought as a move in a game. You see how this metaphor will come into play in fouls, time and time again. And he says, it talks about this principle of fighting, playing with the speech acts. It is not that one plays, he says, in order to win. A move can be made for the sheer pleasure of its invention. You see how Lyotard, Barthes, all of them, Fowles, are all talking about this concept of what is aesthetic pleasure and how does one really look at aesthetic pleasure in the postmodern context. Labor of language harassment, great joy has to be had in the endless invention of turns of the phrase, of words and meanings, the process behind the evolution of language on the level of parole. But undoubtedly, even this pleasure depends on a feeling of success, won at the expense of an adversary. And notice this. You see, fighting, jostling, playing, a formidable one. What is the adversary which language games play against? The accepted language or connotation. And in the case of John Fowles, the accepted form of the novel. Right. It is with that background, it is with that reading of three major critics that I come to another critical term. I'm sorry if this sounds a little theory heavy for the moment, but this is what I do for bread and butter. And the term I come to is metafiction. Now, what is metafiction? This is something which a lot of, critical words have been spent over. Now, metafiction, the first is a definition which is offered by Patricia Ward, and she talks about metafiction as being fictional writing which is self-consciously and systematically draws attention to its status. There was an advertisement which probably was that of Complan, which said, "Dako ami barchi mami," right? See, mother, I'm growing. Metafiction says, see, I'm fiction. It keeps on asking the reader, poking him and says, are you thinking about illusion? Are you thinking that this is reality? No, I am fiction. It is systematically drawing attention to its status as an artifact. But why is it doing so? That's the question. The question is not how it is drawing attention, although that is something we'll discuss, or why it is doing so. In order to pose questions about the relationship between fiction and reality. So metafiction asks you, what you are reading, is it real? What you are seeing, is it real? You see, when in this age of post-truth, we look at something, we look at a piece of writing, everything as it were, all news has it become metafiction in a certain way. But remember that not anything that draws attention to itself is metafiction. It has to be systematic. You see, Tom Jones is metafiction because all through the 18 books, Fielding is drawing attention and saying, look, this is a new province of writing that I am engaged in. It cannot be a sporadic, periodic work. When I worked on my thesis, for example, I saw that Defoe was only part metafiction because he did it in the preface. But Fielding was truly metafictional, and of course Sterne was greatly metafictional. Now, the other definition is offered by Mark Curry. Curry suggests that metafiction is a borderline discourse which places itself on the border between fiction and criticism. And it treats the border as its subject. So, it exists on the border, and this is an interesting theory because Fowles is going to use it. He's going to use the form of fiction, but that border between fiction and criticism is going to choose as the subject of his fiction. It dramatizes the border, uses it as an energy source, and has meant the assimilation, he says, of a critical perspective within the fictional narrative. Right? So, what metafiction does is, as every step, to interrogate how fiction is written, one, and two, how fiction is related to reality. But it does one thing. It never allows you to forget that what you are looking at is fiction. It is not reality. Well, there's a lot of definitions that I have given, but I will not linger on them. I would rather move on to a nomenclature. What kind of metafictions do we have? Now, the first form is overt form, where you just write about writing the fiction, right? You do not bother about any plot whatsoever. Examples of this are, say, If on a Winter's Night, a Traveller by Italo Calvino, or say Nabokov's Pale Fire. To a certain extent, Tristram Shandy is not about Uncle Toby, is not about Walter Shandy, not about Tristram Shandy at all. It just lays bare the writing of the narrative. How or what are the conventions of writing? But I'm not interested so much today in the overt form. I'm interested in that covert form, where the covert form actually uses a structure of conventional fiction and then sabotages it. And that is a word which I'm going to use here. Sabotages it from within. So it creates a fictional structure. Apparently, it's a realist novel. And suddenly you find that the author is sort of eating into or probing into the ways in which this form, the structure is continually eroded, right? Through plot, allegory, narrative metaphor, or even narratorial commentary. In that case, Money Heist, The Mask is interesting because these are people who have the system, who know the system, but who work into the system and try to subvert it. And this is also, again, something which, of course, you can understand once you talk about fiction and reality, you're also going to talk about fiction and history. And therefore, this is, once again, Patricia Waugh talking, and Linda Hutcheon. This concept of historiographic metafiction was advocated by Linda Hutcheon, who talked about historiographic metafiction, the postmodern novel, which rejects projecting present beliefs and standards onto the past and asserts the specificity and particularity of the individual past events. So until and unless, he says, you are reliving history, you cannot write history. So what we will write is pervasively fictional, right? That using the paratextual conventions of historiography to both inscribe and undermining the authority and objectivity of historical, I'm sorry, just excuse me for a moment. Of historical sources and explanations. Am I audible, by the way?
Yes, you are. You are.
Yes.
Sorry, I just got a little distracted thinking that the phone call was suggesting I'm not audible. Anyways, so inscribing and undermining the authority and objectivity of historical sources and explanations. Now, many critics have actually talked about metafiction as being related to existentialism, because existential man is, as it were, free, so he can bear no illusions about his mortality and about the limited nature of his perspective. And the word which is being used with metafiction is, of course, narcissism. It can be judged in terms of its own internal validity. Now, I will not go into this, although existentialism could have come into my discussion of the French Lieutenant's Woman, probably will for a very brief moment. And maybe then I will talk about this existentialism as something which there is no given or inscribed, as it were, essence, one theorization, one way of looking at things. But existence and existentialism by itself is marked by infinite choices, right? So, when Sarah stands at the Cobb, and I'll show you a picture of Meryl Streep there, you are actually, dramatizing this essential existential moment, as it were. But I'll come to it when I come to it. Now, metafiction, what does it do to the reader? metafiction actually has 3 stories to offer. And this is a thesis which is advocated not by me, but by Umberto Eco. Umberto Eco suggests that a metafictional text first has a story of what happens to its dramatis personae. So this French lieutenant's woman is this triangular love story. What happens to Charles? What happens to Sarah and Ernestina? Then there's the story of the naive reader who reads this text as a text of a triangular love. But what the metafictionist wants really to do and to reach is to tell the reader about what happens to it as a text. So this is a story not of the dramatis personae, but how the text has evolved, or how the writing of the text, how the language has evolved. And this third story is a story which appeals to the critical reader. Right, so story 1, dramatis personae. Story 2, naive reader. Story 3, what happens to it as a text, and the critical reader. And this is Cortázar, who talks about making the reader an accomplice, a traveling companion, simultaneize him. You see, when I talk about Cortázar, I remember Fielding. Fielding, when in the last book of Tom Jones, will talk about, reader, you and I are therefore come to the end of the journey, and he'll embrace the reader, and he says, farewell thee, reader, and so on and so forth. What does Fielding do? Simultaneousing the reader, alerting him to the metafictional possibilities. You see, that's why I say, although I use the term postmodern, I wouldn't say it's just a time frame. The postmodern tendencies are within the birth of the novel itself. Because you see, the novel is that form which comes of different polarized narratives, and it's therefore always inherently critical. I can go back also to the ur-text of the novel, Cervantes, Don Quixote, and the way in which the novel is born out of parody, as it were. The novel is, as all of you who have known Bakhtin and have read him realize, that it's polyphonic in its fundamental, as a fundamental characteristic. Right. Now, what are the strategies of metafiction? This is also something which we need to, for a moment, look at. What are the familiar strategies of metafiction? Questioning the basic devices of realistic narratives. And you see, these are the devices of realist narrative: character, plot, openings, closures, by foregrounding the codes through which narrative is written. If you are interested, you can read about the 5 codes that Barth talks about. Intertextuality, the text frequently refers to other texts. Parody. Parody is a very familiar, structure that metafiction uses. And irony. And irony is something I'm going to talk about when I talk about false. Now, let me come to this particular text, the French lieutenant's woman. I'm going to work through it by the setting, the issue of character. Fowles uses multiple endings, for example. I think there's somebody who switched on the microphone. Could I please request you to switch it off? It's creating a slight disturbance for me. Right, thank you. The setting becomes important. The issue of character. Please remember that midway through the novel, actually the author enters into the novel as a character. There are, at the end, multiple endings, 3 endings of the text. One, which is the conventional ending, where Charles marries Ernestina, forgets Sarah. The other, where Charles meets Sarah and takes up Lalage, as it were, and there's a reunion between Charles and Sarah. And then there's the author who switches the clock by 15 minutes, and Charles and Sarah meet, but they do not actually sort of they are not united in that sense of the term. Sarah decides to keep her own independence, and Charles returns to America. So multiple endings, experiments with time, the intrusive narrator whom I've actually talked about, intertextuality. So once again, why does Fowles write about 1867 writing in 1967, 1969 is a question which you have to always ask. And then this question of parody and irony in the way in which Darwin is used as an intertext throughout the novel, along with a lot of other texts as well. Disraeli, for example. Now, the setting, of course, is the Victorian background. You have the crisis in history, the theory of evolution, class conflicts, the movement for the new woman, and the cob. Now, you see, we have to understand all of what is happening. The Victorian background with its rigid morality for women, characterized by the elderly Mrs. Pulteney, who tries to reform Sarah, right? In fact, Fowles talks about how pornography and morality coexisted in the Victorian age, how it was a kind of a, you can say, a paradox. Then there is this crisis in history through, Darwin, and this question of empire coming in, the question of the new woman, rise of, for the first time, you see, Fowles talks about the bill being moved that women should vote. In fact, there was if you remember that the Punch carried a cartoon when this bill was introduced, that can women vote? It became the subject of a great satire in the Punch. So this is the movement that is being launched for the new woman. Class conflicts. In fact, Charles's servant, Sam, invites comparison with Dickens's servant, Sam. Right, the servant in Dickens's novel, and how the concept of class undergoes a change. So 1867, as Fowles sees, is that moment of crisis where a lot of social changes, churnings take place. 1967, on the other hand, 1969 or 67, whatever you say it, is the moment when there is a churning in criticism. There's a churning in the ways in which fiction is being looked at. So one churning is looking at another churning. One evolution is looking at another evolution. You have to see what Fowles is trying to do here. How does Fowles question this author persona? Because after all, I've spent a lot of time working on this. And Fowles, he confesses to the reader. He says, the story I'm telling is all imagination. This is where the metafiction operates. These characters I create never existed out of my mind. Because I'm writing, he says, in a convention of omniscient narration, universally accepted at the time of my story that the novelist stands next to God. This is what Fowles is trying to deconstruct. I live, he says, in the age of Alan Robert Greeley, the proponent of the new novel, the Nouveau Roman. And Roland Barthes, you see, here Barthes comes in as a character, as it were, a scripter in his own right. If this is a novel, it cannot be a novel in the modern sense of the word. See how criticism is being brought into the border between the novel and criticism, and how this is operative as metafiction. We know a world is an organism, not a machine. We know that a genuinely created world must be independent of its creator. You see how Fowles is narratively rewriting Barthes. A planned world is a dead world. It is only when our characters and events begin to disobey us that they begin to live. And that is probably the great postmodern statement. Right. And Fowles goes on to add, and this is once again, you see, this is all happening within the novel. You see how within the structure is being eroded. Is a God sense it creates. But what has changed is that we are no longer the gods of the Victorian image, but in the new theological image, and that is where you see existentialism comes in, freedom as our first principle, not authority. Have I broken the illusion? He then asks the reader. My characters still exist. Fiction is woven into all. I find this new reality or unreality more valid. And then he asks a very basic question. This is something which I want you students to think about. When you talk about yourself, when you write your autobiography, or for that matter, when you put up a post on social media, this is what Fowles is asking you. Is a character real or imaginary? Are you real? Or the reality that you put out true? You do not even think of your own past as quite real. You dress it up, you gild it, blacken it, censor it, tinker with it, right? Something that's continually happening today on social media. The persona that you project is not the person that you are. And Fowles says that I don't exist because I am not the authority. I'm just a tissue of quotations that have come in from a tissue of cultures, right? I am writing, I am a person who's writing in a certain way, and I'm trying to deconstruct that way of writing. I'm playing a language game with you because you, my reader, you too are continually playing language games with me and everybody. So all of us are engaged in a pervasive creation of an illusion, right? That, he says, we are all in flight from the real reality. That is a basic definition of Homo sapiens. So when you think about yourself not as somebody who's real. Think of your presentation to society as something that is inherently illusory rather. Did I confuse you royally? Thank you, I have succeeded then. Right, and Fowles says, this is where, the author has entered the railway compartment in which, the coach in which Charles is going to London, and Charles has fallen asleep and the author is looking at him, with his beard and so on and so forth. And he says that there's only one person who can look at a person in that particular way, that particular look with its bizarre blend of the inquisitive and the magistral, of the ironic and the soliciting. And that is what every reader, those of you who write stories, that perpetually think, what could I do with you? How could he use you? I see this, he says, with a particular clarity on the face only too familiar to me of the bearded man who stares at Charles. And that bearded man is the man whose picture I showed you, John Fowles. And then you see what the metaphor that Fowles once again uses is that of fixing the game. You see, we talked about Lyotard and the way in which, the great adversary exists, how you can tinker with the game. I say fiction usually pretends to conform to the reality. The writer puts the conflicting wants in the ring and then describes the fight. But Fowles goes on to add that the writer then fixes the fight, letting that want he himself favors win. So the ending that he wants, the ideology that he professes, that is the one which he uses, right? And we judge writers of fiction both by the skill they show in fixing the fights and by the kind of fighter they fix in favor of. The good one, the tragic one, the evil one, the funny one, and so on. So it's a game that is being played. It's a choice that is being made. And as the alert reader, you need to understand, or we need to understand, that everything that exists is illusory, that nothing is real. And once you've looked at that, it's a very metaphysical question, isn't it? Once you look that everything is illusory, that all the narratives that are given to us are grand narratives, it is only then that your micro-narrative of the reader will come through. Now, and that is where, I will very briefly look at Darwin. You see, there are two characters here who profess to be Darwinians. One is Dr. Grogan, and the other is Charles. Charles is an amateur paleontologist. Both of them recognize their kinship with Darwin and consider themselves moral. Yet, the irony is that these Darwinians are in reality conservative. When Charles encounters Sarah for the last time, Sarah is with the household of the Dante Gabriel Rossettis. That is another intertext here. You remember Dante Gabriel Rossetti and the pre-Raphaelites were the ones who were combining sensuality and religion, therefore trying to alter discourses, trying to evolve a new discourse of art itself. And you understand how Sarah, with her ambition to transcend her class, with her desire to have the newfound freedom for the woman, actually sees kinship between the Rossetti household and herself. Sarah wants a freedom to choose. When Charles finally encounters her, he is betrayed by Sarah's lie, as it were, that Sarah has lied to him, and he judges Sarah morally, as it were. He does not understand. He is not a true Darwinian in the sense he does not understand the complexity and evolution of Sarah is still located within the patriarchal thought of controlling the woman. Grogan also, he sort of categorizes Sarah as the melancholic one who chooses melancholy as a kind of basis of living, not understanding that Sarah's desire is not to be melancholic, but Sarah's desire is one of inherent freedom. So in that sense, you see, the irony remains that the Darwinian within the text, the professed Darwinians, are in reality conservatives. The only real Darwinian here is Sarah, who seeks a separate degree of autonomy for herself. And the real Darwinian in the 1969 is the reader and the new novelist who refuses to take on the garb of God and who allows the reader the freedom. The irony, therefore, this is very interesting, the irony is therefore on you. If you can understand the evolution, you appreciate the novel. If you do not understand it, then the novel is almost freakish. The novel is almost, parodic in its quality. But the parody here is an essential parody into questioning the very basis through which, or the conventions through which the novel operates. So if you read it as a conventional Victorian text, as a naive reader of what happens to its dramatis personae, then you have not evolved. You have evolved only if you enter into the language games that Fowles is playing with you, and therefore emerge as a critical reader. There's another category which I would like to very briefly linger on, and that is America. 1867, America is already a land where you have a larger female autonomy. And therefore, when Charles goes, Charles sees around him to master a national destiny had a liberating and a depressing effect, rather than a depressing effect. The abundant evidence of a restless dissatisfaction, a tendency to take the law into one's own hands, the endemic violence caused by a liberate, besotted constitution, some found justification in Charles's eyes. A spirit of anarchy was all over the South, and even that seemed to him preferable to the rigid iron rule of his own country. This is not Charles. This is the novelist. This is the new reader of the new novel, who will, with the spirit of anarchy, who will, with the spirit of freedom, liberty, violate the written constitution of the novel and write a new constitution for it. Remember Alan Robert Greeley writing a new manifesto for the new novel. You see, this is where what I'm trying to suggest is that evolution, history, is being reworked by Fowles so that it can rebound and alert the 1969 reader rather than the 1867 event. The 1867 event or the novel becomes a gateway through which Fouls can trigger, alert, and what I call sort of anarchically almost question and deconstruct the form of the novel. That is why evolution and America becomes so critical to the understanding of the novel. And this is Sarah and her final stance. I wanted to share this with everybody concerned because, you see, there are certain portions in the novel which have to be critically read. You see, Sarah is lonely, right? Existentialism, as we have seen always, is painful. For example, you have, all of us are besotted with Beckett, talking about waiting for Godot and the pain, the angst, and so on. But Sarah sees this existential moment of choice, of loneliness, not as something of an angst. It's something of a freedom. I found that I treasure it. I found that I treasure loneliness. I don't want to share my life. I wish to be what I am, not what a husband, however kind, however indulgent, must expect me to become in marriage. So you see, this is also an evolution of that existential moment of choice, where choice becomes liberating, not only in terms of living, but also in terms of writing. It says, I never expected to be happy in life, yet I find myself happy where I'm situated now in the Dante Gabriel Rossetti household, where choices are being made, where freedoms are being explored. I have varied and congenial work. I am admitted to the daily conversation of genius. They are not those the world chooses to imagine. See, a community of honorable endeavor, of noble purpose that I had till not now known existed in this world. This is once again, you see, not a story of the dramatis personae. This is a story of you and me, the people who are reading this in 1969. Imagine, we are now used to postmodernism as almost a dated concept. But see what it must have been like to read The French Lieutenant's Woman in the 1970s. I am at last arrived to where I belong, says. I owe a debt to my good fortune. I'm not going to seek it elsewhere. I'm to see it as precious, precarious, as a thing of which I must not allow myself to be bereft. Right? So, you see, this freedom to choose, this freedom to interpret, this freedom to have multiplicity in the text is the moment when Paul says is precious. And that is why the French lieutenant's whore, woman being a whore, I'm sorry, please do not understand. French lieutenant's woman, as it were, was said, would have understood the French lieutenant's whore. It's something which Fouls turns inside out, ironically. The French lieutenant's woman becomes the most liberated woman at this point of time. And you see, that is why I want you to see the background of the novel. You see, without this picture, you don't understand the French lieutenant's woman. You see, the image of Sarah standing right at the edge of that quayside, right, the quayside, and staring out into life, the one figure, lonely, yet reveling in her loneliness. Her loneliness is not something which is suffering. That loneliness is voluntary. That loneliness is her liberation. That is where the French lieutenant's woman would succeed as a novel. The evolution of the single novelist who protests against the conventions and who ushers in the death of the author and the birth of the reader, and therefore a new sunrise, as it were, and therefore the three endings, freedom to choose, playing around with time, and a direct entry into the process of communication. You have, of course, intertextuality and irony, references to Darwin, Mill, Arnold, and irony directed against Charles, Dr. Grogan, and very importantly, at every stage, you see irony is directed at the reader. What are your expectations? Do you understand my text? Are you liberated? Are you accepting, or do you accept my freedom to choose? These are things that Fouls is continually asking us. Now, a couple of concluding slides before I I have already probably stepped over my time. But the critique of metafiction, a lot of critics have suggested that metafiction has dealt a fatal blow to the form, that it is only for critical readers who are academic, who do not really read novels for the pleasure of reading novels, that everything has gone, reality does not exist, time does not exist, personality does not exist, and therefore they see metafiction as deeply nihilistic, leading to the collapse of the novel. Now, I could probably go on with this, but I'd just like to end with this slide and saying that, the self-reflexivity does not weaken, but on the contrary, strengthens and points to the level of historical engagement and reference of the text. Right? It does not cast doubt upon the seriousness, but rather defines the new postmodern consciousness that acknowledges the limits and powers of reporting or writing the past, recent or remote. You see, the text that I would like you to probably go back at the end is again by Lyotard. It's a text which I teach in class, but Lyotard defines the postmodern. And he says that postmodernity is marked by three things. One is that the text is a bricolage, right? Random things joined together. Second is that we human beings are not in sync with technology. We are always, as Lyotard says, like Gulliver when we respond to technology, either too great or too small. And therefore, versions of truth which appear are always distorted, are always illusory, right? As I speak, I move from false to post-truth, where the everyday news that we see, the everyday version of events that are being passed off as lived history. We are living history, right? We do not know, for example, what exactly happens in Galwan. We do not know what exactly happens in the neighboring state of Pakistan. We do not know what even happens in Kolkata as the COVID happens, right? We are living in this state of continuous illusion. And therefore, Lyotard says that new postmodern consciousness allows us the ability to be like the advanced God of modernism, to interrogate, to continuously question what is being passed off as truth or what is being passed off as real. At the end of the day, I don't read the French Lieutenant's Woman merely for reading Roland Barthes. I read him because with Barthes, with John Barth, with Fowles, we can forever be cautious of the fact that what is real is fictional, that fiction is woven into everything. And it is this metafictional consciousness, this postmodern inquiry that Barthes, Lyotard, and Fowles are all engaged in doing, either critically or fictionally. It is with that metafiction bears the codes, making us aware how narratives are constructed, making us conscious how we are enmeshed in language, and provides us a critical insight into the strategies of and motives behind all narrative and grand narratives. Right. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to Midnapore College for providing me with this opportunity.
Thank you, Radha, from our end, and so kind of you to take time out of your schedule. As expected, Professor Sen's talks are always a combination of erudition and communicability, but this time the talk was also very dense, as he has moved through some well-known but maybe difficult to understand critics, particularly for the students who are reading about them for the first time. So this talk would require a second listening, maybe a third, or maybe even a fourth. To answer the query posted by Vicky Prasad in the chat box, we are going to later put on the whole thing on YouTube. So we are going to be able to come back to the talk and again note things down as is required. Time now to ask a few questions. Though Amrita has said that he has stepped over the time, but which is absolutely fine with us, because we would have loved to keep listening on to him, but he is busy and we can see him sitting in his own office, so he has a lot of lots and lots of works to attend to. So those of you who would like to ask questions, please you can now unmute yourselves and ask the question, or you may even write it down on the chat box. I can see a question, Amrita, if you please. Question in the chat box posted by Devobrat Odhikari, who asks, "Sir, do you think that in the process of decoding a text, if there is an emphasis on reader-oriented interpretations, then in bracket, which should be encouraged, then somewhere it also entails a possibility of distortion, a losing into the labyrinth of decentering, as it can trap us into the infinite play slash game slash illusion slash verisimilitude of what is the actual reality." Should I read it out once again? Or
No. Thank you, Shoykot. That is the classic postmodern paradox, as it were. I won't be the postmodernist and immediately ask you what is the actual reality. You see, Devobruto, this question was actually something which, we once debated very hotly in a refresher course. You coming here in from the person who talked about, who I actually attended this refresher course where a Marxist professor actually demolished postmodernity and suggested that, in moving into the labyrinth, we were actually moving out of the real and tangible problems of everyday life. For example, poverty is something which is there. The man who is trying to earn a little bit of bread would probably not be a postmodernist, and that, it was all academic trap. But you see, very interestingly, it's the same kind of discourse which is now coming into this question of interrogating the narratives. You see, very interestingly, say, I think there's a question of which is also coming in by Dr. Shengupta from Mumbai University, which I'll sort of tie in with this question. You see, she's talked about the pandemic and the gross reality of the pandemic as it hits us, and so therefore question whether we can really put forward various interpretations, and the possibility of interpretive possibilities are there here. But I would still say once again that, you see, alertness in interrogation, that is what Derrida is, that is what Lyotard is perpetually telling us, is postmodernity is not about forgetting the real, right? It is not as if we're just looking at various interpretations, but also the ways in which the reality is being presented to us, right? So what we now realize is that while there is daily existence, the presentation of this, the representation of this rather, which we receive at every day, is the point where we should be undertaking this questioning. Therefore, you see, I've talked about a metafictional consciousness, right? See, for example, with the Amphan disaster, and I'll give you an example which comes to my mind. You see, there are lots of people who are claiming aid. The Amphan is a disaster which has happened. That's true, right? But when you talk about this poverty and the narrative of poverty that people are putting forward, then even at a governmental level, until and unless there is this metafictional consciousness for us also. We will forever be trapped by people who will posit false narratives. And false narratives are continuously created both at an individual level and a governmental level. So the way in which history is being portrayed, the way in which reality is being portrayed, you see, until and unless we did have this postmodern consciousness, we would not have been able to sort of interrogate this migrant crisis so very densely, as it were. So even during the most, difficult of times, as Agamben says, the COVID is where you just live, you just, exist. That's your primary target. Thinking comes much later. But I would say, it's a simultaneous process, reflecting and reacting.
Okay. There is one more question. Yeah, Shoikat Chakraborty, please go ahead.
Yes, sir, this is Shoikat Chakraborty, research scholar in Kazi Nazrul University. First of all, I'd like to thank you for this wonderful session. I have a few observations regarding your whole talk. First of all, I would like you to comment a bit on, as you were referring to Foucault's what is an author, I would like to comment you on Foucault's this idea of this privileged moment of individualization. And another thing is, you have already talked at length about this idea of bricolage. So I would want you to comment on a little bit on Deleuzian notion of this assemblage. And another thing is, I would want you to talk on that. Would you consider Fouls to be an actor on this actant rhizome ontological interpretation of a particular text? That is why he provides so many endings in his text.
Yeah, I'll take only that last question. I actually, because you see, the two other questions, if I take, I'll have to deliver one more talk of an hour, which I think maybe if Shoikat permits sometime later on, I will talk about Deleuze, and I actually wanted to talk about Foucault, but then I realized that, if I started off, I would actually not be able to talk about Fouls at all. Therefore, I would probably, yes, argue, I agree with you in the sense that, Fouls is taking on this role of the actant. And once again, you are leading me towards this notion of the performativity of the act of writing, once again, which is another discourse which I could have talked about really. But, Shoikat, let's say that I was trying to create an entry-level platform for students to understand what Fouls is doing and tinkering with this notion of the author and the evolution of a kind of an author. Where you are trying to lead me towards is a different order of critical discourse which takes off from this. If you want, I can respond to you in writing, but I'm sorry, if I have to respond to these questions, I'll have to speak for 20 more minutes, which I think I really don't have right now. I'm sorry, please excuse me. But those are very good questions. Could you just write them down and send it to me by mail so that I can respond to you?
Right. Sure, sir. Sure. It would be fascinating for me. Sure.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to, dismiss these questions. They're very valid questions, but, I have to get back to work in 5 minutes. So I wouldn't be able to do justice to your question at all right now. But
sure, sir, right on.
I agree with your last contention, although I will have to think and respond to the earlier two that you have suggested. I didn't talk about Foucault. I actually have some notes on Foucault in front of me, where Foucault talks about pervasive anonymity. And you remember, Foucault going back to Beckett and asking this basic question, what matter who's speaking, right? I think, Foucault, that one specific line that Foucault uses, what matter who's speaking, is probably a kind of an answer to all the questions that he's raising. But I will respond to this properly when you write to me, right?
Sure, sir, sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I believe, as Amrita has said, he has to get back to his other duties. And I'm sure you have many more questions to ask, but maybe at a later time. It would be our honor again and privilege if we could host Amrita again maybe like this in this virtual platform, or if time permits and situations change, maybe again in our college, which would be, rather even a greater pleasure for us to do. So,
I'm into that. I'm
yeah,
into that.
I mean, of course. Let's hope for better days in the future. Now, I would like to request our student, Sonia Bhuiya. Sonia, if you're here, could you please deliver the formal vote of thanks? Sonia is our
Yes, sir.
student. Yeah, Sonia, please go ahead.
Am I audible, sir?
You
Yes,
are.
you are.
Perfectly.
Uh, Good morning, everyone. Let me introduce myself. I am Shronia Bhuiya, a student of Midnapore College. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Amrit Sen for his previous time and for sharing his knowledge with us. We are really grateful to you, sir, and feel fortunate to have you in our session. I also appreciate all the participants who have joined the session and made it a success. And last but not the least, of course, I don't know if I will get a better opportunity to thank Professor Tanmoy Kundu. So thank you very much, sir, for organizing the session and uniting all the fellow students in this adverse situation. Well, that's all. Have a good day. Thank you all.
With this, Amrita, we come to the end of our session. Thank you once again so very much. And thank you, everybody, for joining in.
Right. And thank you, everybody, for listening in. Bye.
Thank you.